they had a lot of bought and paid for testimony that wasn't true, and that they had various people who had motives to lie, reasons to lie, and did so. Well, I was initially approached by Mr. Stuckey's family, and they approached me with regard to him having interest in me representing him. He's being held without a bond pre-trial at that stage, and at one point in time the case was a potential death penalty case because it had to go through D.C. to see whether or not it was going to be authorized. It was not authorized, and ended up with various allegations of conspiracy, drug distribution, and intentional killing, which was the most serious of the counts as it related to Richard Darbins, or Ricardo Darbins.
Why did they try to seek the death penalty, and why do you think it was turned down?
Well, in federal court, it's typical when there is an intentional killing and they believe that it's linked to some type of narcotic activity or other criminal activity, that the case will go through for a potential death sentence. Will go through main justice. That's the protocol.
And who was this Rico Darbins guy?
Ricardo Darbins was a former DPD officer who no longer worked for DPD, who had been indicted in federal court for various other violations unrelated to Thelma and Stuckey. And the government's position or theory was that Mr. Stuckey killed him to keep him quiet.
Oh, he was indicted for things that didn't have anything to do with Stuckey originally.
Correct. He had a separate indictment of which Mr. Stuckey was not a part of, and there were no allegations relative to that indictment.
What about the Steve Felder guy?
Steve Felder is probably one of the most offensive situations I've ever seen in a prosecution. Steve Felder is a confessed, admitted killer who the FBI swung a deal with in order for him to testify against Thelma and Stuckey. And for them to cut a deal with somebody who admits to being a murderer and let him walk the streets is kind of offensive, and it tells you how bad they wanted Thelma and Stuckey.
Was Felder, I read somewhere that Felder confessed or was convicted of a similar murder?
Felder, here's the backdrop on Steve Felder. I represented another gentleman some years ago, Anthony Gates. And I've represented Anthony Gates on many cases, on various cases, and he was always acquitted. But the important thing about Anthony Gates and Steve Felder is this. At one point in time, Anthony Gates was charged with murder. First-degree murder for killing a young man and leaving him in the trunk of a car, duct tape, rolled up, etc. And the one thing that he always said to me is, I'm honest with you, I have nothing to do with this. That gentleman sat in jail for a year waiting for a trial with an alleged confession to DPD, or to an informant, of course. We tried the case. The case went on for about 3 weeks. He was found not guilty, finally, of all charges. Fast forward, the Stuckey case. We're involved in the Stuckey case. We've been litigating it for a long time, probably in excess of a year. And during the trial, the government went to the judge and asked the judge in camera whether or not they had to disclose certain information to me because they thought I had figured something out. It turned out that their main witness, Steve Felder, against Thelma and Stuckey, actually did the murder that they had previously charged Anthony Gates with an alleged confession. So that's kind of a hint of the extent to which informants will go, and sometimes even law enforcement, to get a conviction. So now Felder has confessed that he did the prior murder because they thought I figured it out because I'd done the previous murder case and that I had the discovery on the previous murder case. So Felder comes forward and acknowledges to them during the course of our trial at the last minute, oh, I forgot to tell you, I killed somebody, and I killed him the same way that they claim Stuckey killed Ricardo Darbins. And I left him the same way, rolled up, in a trunk, etc. And so the modus operandi for these two murders were identical. And Felder's the only alleged eyewitness. Presents a problem for the government.
What about also the drug portion of it? Stuckey was never caught in a deal or with any drugs. It was all on the word of somebody saying.
That's correct. Of drugs were from those who had been basically previously convicted and who cut a deal with the government, who said, I'll testify with the understanding that you do something for me, you help me, you've caught me with drugs, I'll say that I got them from Stuckey, or I'll say that Stuckey and I have a drug relationship. And many of these people knew that Stuckey was a target and had been for some period of time.
Step going back, let's talk about why maybe Stuckey was a target. The incident at the nightclub, and
Sure.
did Ray Richards handle that? But was he sort of working? Does he work with you sometimes? Or?
Ray Richards and I used to work together. There was a time when we did, but I'm not familiar with Ray Richards handling that.
Okay. But you remember,
I do. I'm aware of the shooting incident. Yeah.
So do you think that the Detroit police and the federal law enforcement generally, because he had gotten out in 1992, then he...
Radar. There's no question about it. I mean, everybody knows who he is. You've got shooting incidents around him and various other things. And you have people probably in the street who are giving his name for various things. So certainly he's on their radar, both locally and federally. And anytime the locals have a difficult time pursuing a prosecution, the next thing that typically happens, if it's at a certain level, is it goes federal.
Briefly, if you could mention, you've done a lot of high-profile cases,
Yeah.
and mention a few, just who they were, but compare the strength of this case against some other, did this strike you as a weaker case than some other cases?
I've done several cases, including the Chambers Brothers case, and various other. I represented Riley Graham, who was charged with a large distribution network and putting a kilo of cocaine into the size of a hockey puck. This case, from an evidentiary standpoint, in my opinion, had less evidence than most by far. Because really all they were relying on was the testimony of informants versus wiretaps versus we've got an arrest where he's got some kilos, or we've got a lot of money that we seized that's in his hands. This case was built pretty much solely on informants and historical data versus any type of active investigation that typically is done by DEA or the FBI.
Did they try to tie him in or imply or talk a lot about the PAs, the whole...
The underlying inference was the PAs. However, the PAs was not something that was presented in court. We didn't have to defend the PAs or litigate the PAs.
Okay. Could you talk about, your, on a personal level, just was he a little different than a lot of the clients?
He's a very... first of all, he's very sharp, and you've got to understand that he's a businessman. And he's somebody who certainly is a very strong personality. He's somebody who's going to be very actively involved in his own defense and is going to make some decisions that perhaps may be inconsistent with the recommendation even of counsel, but he's going to make decisions that he believes are appropriate. And as a lawyer, it's your job to advise the client. They can make the ultimate decisions, but Mr. Stuckey certainly somebody who is very, very active and very strong-minded and strong-willed.
Well, could tell us about the case and some of those humorous things you were telling us when we first came in.
Probably.
Walk us through the whole case.
Probably, if I walked you through the whole case, we'd be here for a month. But
take us through the highlight.
probably every trial has its lighter moment, so to speak. Even the most serious of trials, and this certainly was one of those. But probably one of the lighter moments of the trial was a lot of questions were being asked about various people who were involved in the rap industry who were artists on Stuckey's label. And one of the probably most memorable moments was when the prosecutor, Mr. Buckley, was questioning one of them and basically inferring that he couldn't rap, he couldn't write music or do other things. And so he was trying to really go after him in front of the jury. And he asked him, well, since you are such a writer and a rapper and you're so creative, why don't you give us something? So he did give him something. He told him he was up on the stand with his man Buckley, who was trying to fuck him. And it was trying to fuck me, quote unquote, on the stand with my man Buckley, and he's trying to fuck me. And the entire jury laughed, so did the judge. And at the conclusion, I believe the judge's comments were, I assume you have no more questions for this witness. Because it was clear that if nothing else, Stuckey had a label, he had artists, and he had talent.
Did it surprise you that the prosecution took the tact so much of making it about Stuckey's personality and lyrics? Was that because they had so little evidence outside of the informants?
I think that the prosecution's position was that the lyrics mirrored how the murder of Darvin's occurred and how the body was found. And that may have been a hint of their lack of strong evidence, or at least corroborating evidence. They were trying to get something to corroborate anything that these informants said.
What was your strategy in the defense, and how do you think it was working?
Well, the strategy in the defense was very simple, that they had a lot of bought and paid for testimony that wasn't true, and that they had various people who had motives to lie, reasons to lie, and did so. And I think that when it became clear, the situation with, for instance, even Felder and his being dishonest to the government and being a killer who still to this day has not been prosecuted for that murder, the extent to which the government will go to get a conviction.
In your and a lot of knowledge of other cases around the country, was this, I know they've used people's lyrics against them a few other times. Is that considered by a judge? I mean, is that a weird thing to do? Is that considered valid, or?
Well, the problem with this case, or with Stuckey's in particular, is while you've got the lyrics on the CD, that doesn't mean that he wrote them. You got to ask who wrote the lyrics, why they were written, and who performed them. Just because you perform something that someone wrote, if in fact you did, doesn't mean that that's something that you personally did. You've got to look deeper than it's just on a CD. And that's something that I think wasn't done very well in this case.
So tell us, what you told us, that it seemed like you were winning, and even the judge, and then what happened?
Well, we absolutely were in a very good position, I believe, personally. Certainly we had, in my opinion, we had beat probably the murder case, and we were on a very good roll on the narcotics case, and very well may have been in a position with that. And at some point in time it became clear that the government's case was having trouble. But nonetheless, they ultimately ended up with a conviction.
Talk about his decision to get on the stand.
Well, I can't talk about the communications we had with regard to him getting on the stand, but he did make a decision to testify. Once he did make that decision to testify and testified, various other evidence came in that otherwise had not been presented to the jury.
So that hurt him? Including
the shootings.
Oh, so that hurt him?
I would suspect that probably would. Probably had a very negative impact on the jury and their perception.
How did he was in the newspaper and all that stuff while the case was going on? It was kind of a throwback to the 80s, when the papers loved to have all the Maserati Ricks, Whiteway Rick, Chambers, and blah, blah, blah in the paper. That they don't, even though those same type of crimes still occur, it's not as trendy for the newspaper to put it in. He was kind of the last gasp of that to be covered like that. Why do you think that?
Well, I've been involved in a lot of high-profile criminal defense work, and you have to manage the media no matter what you do, and that's something that's just a part of a high-profile case, and you have to accept. Certainly you want to question the jurors before they get on the panel about their level of knowledge and information that they've received, as well as their source. But once they're on the jury, there's not much you can do about that, other than from time to time, if you believe something has occurred or there's an article, ask the judge to inquire of the jurors whether or not they've read anything since the trial started. But in a high-profile case, that's just a fact of life.
Wasn't there an incident where that was Felder who claimed that Stuckey came into the visiting booth when he was in the county jail, or was that somebody else?
Correct. There was the allegation that he came in to the visiting booth to intimidate him while I believe it was Felder's mother was visiting.
Do you think that was made up, or?
We don't know if it's made up or not made up. That's something that Felder testified to. If you want to take the word of a liar and a murderer, then that's your choice.
So that may not even be true, and that was something they used against him. Didn't they make it difficult for him to communicate with even his lawyers?
There were certain protective orders that were in place that prevented him receiving information at a certain level and at a certain point in time because of the concern for this great fear of safety. And you have to recognize that this trial came right behind the first terrorism case here in the Eastern District of Michigan, and before the same judge. So the Stuckey case was tried before Judge Rosen immediately after the terrorism case, where you've got this great fear of terrorism, and now here we've got this guy who is, according to the government, one of the biggest dope dealers and murderers ever out there. So there was a certain level of fear that was instilled in there, which was not helpful.
What now? Now he's still, thinks he's going to get out. And I mean, are you working with him now? And what do you think? Does he have a grounds for appeal, or?
I am currently not working on the case. I've not been involved with the case since the trial.
Do you think there's any? I mean, everyone wants to get out of prison. Do you think there's any procedural, real way that he could get an appeal?
Well, I can't give you an opinion on that because I'm not involved with it. But I know that he's hopeful that he gets some relief. And if he gets some relief and the case is retried, I'm sure it'll be tried differently, and perhaps he'll get a better result.
Anything else you'd like to say?
I was going to ask him, like, as far as the witness that they brought forth, was it just?
Oh yeah, the cast of characters they pulled in was pretty interesting. It wasn't all just street people.
Oh no, it by far was not just street people. Some of the reason for bringing those witnesses in were to talk about the money and how much money flowed and his level of influence and some of the people that he knew and was familiar with. So no, it by far was not just street people. And even if you look at those who testified from a narcotic perspective, who said that they were involved with him, when you say street people, you're talking about people who are higher level. You're not talking about somebody selling rocks on a corner.
Who were some of the maybe more famous people that you had to cross-examine? Do you remember?
That's difficult. It's been a while. I've done.
Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Yeah, I remember that name. Yeah. But I believe that was a part of the money laundering. Activity.
And you did have a defense, even the circumstantial evidence of, hey, where did this guy get all this money? I mean, he got a lawsuit. He got an insurance claim.
Right.
He did have some legitimate sources of income.
Correct. And even the music business.
Okay. Could you just say he did have some? We were able to introduce.
He clearly had legitimate sources, plural, of income. There's no question about that. I think the government's theory was that we acknowledge that he has some legitimate sources of income, but the problem is, how did he get there?
From law enforcement perspective, if I'm charging you with a crime, right, and we're going to give you 20 years in prison because you're dangerous and you should be off the street.
Sure.
How am I remiss in my law enforcement duties to say, well, you should be off the street for 20 years because you're dangerous, but, well, Steve Felder, perfect example, but we'll let you walk away if you help us put him away. Is that a slippery slope of?
That's something that occurs on a daily basis, but you have to make your own judgment on how right and wrong it is, and you have to give some judgment as to whether or not this person is telling the truth or they're just trying to get a time cut, whether or not they're just trying to help themselves. One of the things that they had in this case, and they were very adamant about as it related to Stuckey, was his no snitching and the t-shirts and that. And because he was adamantly opposed to people who obviously cooperate or are also known as a snitch. But you usually want something to corroborate what these people are saying. It's very difficult, I think, to put somebody's life in the hands of a snitch without independent information.
So using informants as part of a whole package is probably has to be done, but to build a case solely on 2-3 guys that are in trouble themselves pointing the finger and there's not any physical evidence against the person is troublesome.
Very troublesome. It's a problem that has to be closely monitored. And we all have seen the situations where you've got an informant who's supposedly working with the government, but they're double dealing or they're doing their own thing and they're lying about things. And usually when somebody's an informant, they're going to protect those who are close to them and they're going to make allegations against those who aren't. And that's one of the unfortunate parts of offering somebody a deal.
He referred to his case as being built on ghost dope. Is the government frequently able to convict people on large-scale drug conspiracies without, 1 gram of anything?
It's been done before, and in the federal building it happens more often probably than anywhere else because they'll allege a consummation. But 9 times out of 10, in most cases, there's some independent corroborating evidence where we've at least got a traffic stop, or we've got this person on a wiretap, or we've got an active some type of surveillance so that we can show the connection between these people, and this is the case where all those things were lacking. I have a theory, and that is losing's not an option. And anybody who tells you it's not about winning has never been a winner. And I don't believe in losing. I don't like to lose. And I'm going to give every case my A game because I don't like to lose. Period.